That night didn't begin like a disaster. It began like any other evening that money could buy. Polished shoes clicking on marble floors, a luxury car idling under soft rain, and a woman who had never once worried about a bill in her life. I had built an existence so wrapped in control that even chance seemed afraid to cross me. Yet destiny doesn't always come, dressed in grand invitations. Sometimes it arrives in the smallest places, under flickering neon, carrying the scent of burnt coffee and fried bread, wearing the face of a stranger who changes everything without meaning to. I remember the diner, the hum of cheap jazz spilling from a broken speaker, the waitress tired but kind, the fluorescent light trembling above the counter. I had stopped there out of impulse, wanting something ordinary for once, something human after another meeting full of artificial smiles. I ordered a simple meal, the kind I hadn't touched in years. But when the check arrived, I reached for my purse and felt nothing. My wallet was gone. The realization crawled through me slowly, the way fear always does when pride is watching. I searched again, smiled awkwardly at the waitress, said I must have left it in the car, and promised to be right back. But she had already seen the truth, the nervous fingers, the heat rising to my face, the hush that fell around our table. A couple near the door whispered. Someone laughed softly, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt helpless. That's when I heard his voice, steady, low, almost apologetic. "I'll cover it." I turned and saw him, a man dressed in worn clothes, sleeves rolled at the elbows, the kind of person people look through instead of at. His eyes, though, were different. They were calm, certain. He didn't ask what I drove or where I lived. He didn't hesitate to pull out a handful of coins, so few that they made a dull sound against the counter, and press them into the waitress's hand. I wanted to protest, to say I'd pay him back, but he only smiled in a way that silenced pride itself. "Don't worry about it," he said, and turned away, before I could even find my words. He walked out of the diner like someone escaping nothing, just moving through the world quietly, leaving grace in his wake. I followed him out into the night, the rain falling harder now, streetlights bending in puddles. I called out once, twice, my voice cracking through the damp air, but the sidewalk was empty. The sound of footsteps had already vanished into the rhythm of the city. I stood there, half-drenched, heart beating with something that wasn't embarrassment anymore. It was awe. How could someone with so little give so easily, when those of us who had everything measured generosity like profit? I went back inside, left a note for him on the counter, though I knew he'd never see it. That night, I lay awake, the city glowing beyond my windows, replaying the brief moments between our eyes meeting and his disappearing silhouette. I didn't know his name. I didn't know his story. But I knew I had been seen, not as a figure in magazines or headlines, but as a person who had momentarily lost control of her perfect life. He saw that, and didn't flinch. And as dawn broke, I made a promise I couldn't explain, to find him again, to repay something deeper than money. But days blurred into weeks, and he never appeared. Sometimes, though, when I walked past that diner, I could almost feel him there, an invisible memory in motion, a ghost made of kindness. What I didn't know was that fate had already begun writing the next chapter, and it would bring him back into my life in ways I could never imagine. They say some faces blur with time, but he refused to fade. It lived behind my eyelids like a memory that kept breathing, haunting every reflection I saw of myself. The man who gave me kindness when I least deserved it had vanished, leaving behind a silence that echoed louder than any goodbye. I didn't know why I couldn't let go, but the more I searched, the more I realized I wasn't just looking for him. I was looking for the part of me that disappeared with him that night. The next morning, after that encounter, I woke to the sound of my world continuing, as if nothing had happened. Emails chiming, calls waiting, the hum of wealth pretending to be purposeful. Yet beneath the silk sheets and glass walls, I felt a gnawing emptiness that no comfort could quiet. I went back to the diner, my heels tapping against cracked pavement that smelled faintly of rain. The same waitress was there, her eyes soft but puzzled when I asked about the man who had paid for me. She didn't remember him. "People come and go here every night," she said. "They don't usually leave names." I tried everything after that. I left notes, descriptions, and questions. I called nearby shelters and community kitchens, inventing excuses for my inquiries. Each time, the answer was the same. No one knew him. It was as if he had stepped out of the world just long enough to save me, then returned to wherever the forgotten go. The thought unsettled me more than I could admit. I went back to my glossy office towers and marble floors, to meetings that felt like performances and conversations that rang hollow. But somewhere between the flash of cameras and the clink of champagne, I began to feel the slow collapse of something invisible inside me. Every success started tasting like ash. Every familiar face began to feel like a stranger's mask. I smiled harder, laughed louder, and kept pretending, because that's what the wealthy learn best, how to hide their emptiness in gold. But at night, when the noise died and the mirrors were honest, I would see him again. That gentle smile, the quiet steadiness in his eyes, the warmth that felt more real than any diamond I'd ever worn. It became my secret anchor. In a life that was falling apart in glittering slow motion, that single act of kindness became my only truth. Months blurred together. My marriage cracked beneath the weight of ambition and silence. My company began bleeding losses. Friends grew distant when the headlines changed. I stopped attending the galas. The expensive perfumes gathered dust. I learned that wealth protects no one from loneliness. It only decorates it. And through it all, his image followed me. Calm, unjudging, unforgettable. Sometimes I caught myself walking into small diners again, just to look at the faces of men eating alone. My heart would skip with every familiar posture, every stranger who turned when I entered. But it was never him. Perhaps he had never existed beyond that moment. Perhaps he was a figment conjured by fate to remind me that humanity still existed in a world I had built on performance. Yet deep down, I refused to believe it. I began to write about him, in my journal, in notes that filled the margins of meeting agendas, even in the back of business envelopes. His absence became my prayer. The ache of not finding him became the rhythm of my days. Then the calls started. My investors grew impatient. My father's health declined. My husband left. Everything that had once been my fortress now felt like ruins held together by denial. I would stare at the city skyline from my balcony, thinking how fragile power looks when it's built on the illusion of control. And still, in the middle of that ruin, there was peace in one memory. The sound of coins sliding across a counter, and a stranger's voice saying quietly, "Don't worry about it." That single moment, his voice, his eyes, his grace, outlasted every loss that followed. When everything I owned began to crumble, that memory stayed, untouched, like a light flickering beneath the rubble. I had lost my home, my fortune, my name, but I hadn't lost him. And in the stillness of that final night before everything fell apart, I realized the truth that would shape the rest of my life. Sometimes, the people who disappear aren't gone forever. They're simply waiting for the right moment to be found again. There's something terrifying about silence when you used to rule noise. When the applause fades and the headlines stop printing your name, you're left alone with your reflection. And that's when the ghosts appear. I thought I had already lost everything, but pain has a way of digging deeper. And just when I thought I'd drowned in it, his shadow returned. Not in memory, in reality, in writing, and it nearly stopped my heart. Losing the company didn't happen in a single blow. It happened slowly, like watching sand slip through your fingers while convincing yourself the grip is tight. I was once a woman whose signature could shift markets, whose parties were headline-worthy, whose fiancé beamed in every magazine photo. But power is a fragile crown, and mine shattered the moment betrayal walked in, wearing a familiar face. My fiancée left with a cruel smile and a team of lawyers. The board turned cold. The brand I built was sold off in silence. My name remained, on legal papers and debt sheets. The penthouse went next. The view that once made me feel invincible became a mirror reflecting my downfall. I moved into a modest flat, tucked in the kind of neighborhood I used to speed past without a glance. There were no more velvet curtains or marble floors, just old wooden cabinets, a rusted kettle, and walls thin enough to hear someone crying through them. Sometimes her, sometimes me. I didn't know what I was searching for when I joined the local charity shelter. Maybe it was penance. Maybe I just needed to be somewhere where nobody asked what I used to be. I wore second-hand clothes, tied my hair back, and served soup to women who had known far worse storms. No one cared who I had been. And strangely, that anonymity felt like grace. Then came the day the donation board went up. I wasn't paying attention at first, but a flicker, a name, pulled my gaze like a whisper from the past. Monsieur Tembo. My breath caught. I froze mid-step, staring at the name that had no reason to be there unless fate had just taken my hand. The cashier, a young woman with warm eyes, noticed my pause. She leaned over the counter and said, "Oh, him. He donates quietly, always signs with an M, comes in sometimes, never talk much." I didn't hear the rest. The world had narrowed to 2 words, printed in black ink but glowing like fire in my mind. M's Tembo. The name wasn't common. It wasn't random. I knew it belonged to him, the man who had paid for my meal, the man who had vanished. And now he was here, or at least he had been. Recently, quietly. My knees nearly gave out. I left the shelter that night with my hands trembling in my coat pockets. I whispered his name again and again, as if saying it would make him appear around the next corner. My heart, which had been numb for so long, now pounded with something too powerful to name. It wasn't love. Not yet. It was recognition. It was fate tightening its thread, whispering that I was not done with him. Not yet. That night, I lay awake, listening to every sound. The ticking clock, the humming fridge, the wind outside my window. But all I truly heard was his name. I clutched it like a prayer, like a thread back to the part of me that still believed in second chances. For the first time since losing everything, I had something to chase again. His name was no longer a ghost in my memory. It was a trail, and I was going to follow it, no matter where it led. It's strange how life brings you back to the very place you thought you'd outgrown, the kind of place where humility smells like soup, and kindness wears tired hands. I had spent years rebuilding the ruins of my life, convincing myself that the stranger who once fed me, hope with a handful of coins, was nothing more than a forgotten memory. But the universe doesn't forget debts of the heart. It collects them quietly and returns them when you least expect it. And that night, when I walked into that dimly lit shelter and saw him, those same eyes, that same soul, I realized some stories don't end. They wait. The rain had just begun when I reached the edge of the old district, where the streetlights flickered weakly and puddles reflected lives most people never looked at. The shelter wasn't grand. It was a crumbling building tucked between warehouses, its windows clouded by years of fog and exhaustion. But when I pushed open the door, the air inside felt alive. The faint aroma of lentil soup, the rhythm of ladles against steel, and laughter, soft, tired, but genuine. It was the kind of place where broken people didn't hide their cracks. They shared them. I paused near the entrance, brushing rain from my coat, my fingers clutching the paper that led me here. His name, printed in fading ink, M. Tembo. I had repeated it to myself like prayer, like proof that hope wasn't a foolish thing. For years, I had searched without knowing what I was hoping to find. Redemption, closure, maybe forgiveness for never thanking him properly. But when my eyes landed on the man at the far end of the room, the ground beneath me seemed to vanish. He was there. Not as I remembered him that night at the diner, young, full of quiet warmth, but older, thinner, with lines that spoke of long days and heavier stories. His hair had silver threaded through it now, and his shirt sleeves were rolled halfway, revealing arms that looked worn, but capable. He stood behind a wooden table, ladling soup into chipped bowls, his movements gentle but precise, like a man who knew the weight of hunger, both the kind that lives in stomachs and the kind that eats at the soul. My breath caught. My throat tightened, because even after all these years, I would have known him anywhere. I stayed hidden in the corner, afraid that if I moved, the spell would break. He laughed with another volunteer, that same deep, warm laugh that used to linger in the air longer than it should have. I watched as a child tugged at his sleeve, a boy no older than 7, his clothes torn and his stomach empty. The pot beside him was nearly scraped clean. He hesitated for only a heartbeat, then unwrapped the sandwich from his own lunchbox and handed it to the boy, smiling as if it were nothing. The child's face lit up, and I felt something in my chest crumble piece by piece. He was still the same man, the one who gave without thinking, the one who carried grace like it was his inheritance. And in that moment, I understood. Some people are not meant to change. They are meant to remind the world what goodness looks like. I wanted to go to him, to speak, to say the words that had haunted me for years. Thank you. I never forgot you. You saved me without knowing you did. But my feet refused to move. My courage, the same courage that once built empires, failed me now. Because I wasn't sure if he'd remember the woman I used to be, the arrogant, polished version of myself who thought the world was hers until it wasn't. And I wasn't sure I was ready for the answer if he didn't. So I stayed there, frozen, invisible among the crowd, watching him live the life I had run from, simple, kind, meaningful. Every gesture he made felt like an echo from the past, and every heartbeat reminded me that I had finally found what I was missing. But maybe too late. When the night ended and the lights dimmed, he stepped outside, his figure illuminated by the weak glow of a street lamp. The rain had stopped, but the air still carried its scent, fresh, forgiving, full of promise. He looked up at the sky, closed his eyes, and exhaled the kind of peace that comes only from a life lived in truth. I wanted to call out his name, but all that escaped my lips was a whisper, carried away by the wind. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling of my small apartment, every breath heavy with memory and disbelief. I had found him, the man who once gave me kindness when I had nothing to offer back. Yet I couldn't shake the question gnawing at me, like a secret I was afraid to answer. Did he remember me? Or was I just another face in the long line of lives he had quietly saved without even realizing it? The thought both comforted and broke me, because sometimes the people who rescue us aren't meant to remember. They're only meant to return when we've finally become ready to remember ourselves. They say money buys freedom, but they never tell you how silent that freedom sounds when it's empty. I had owned penthouses that touched the clouds, driven cars that purred like sin, and worn diamonds that blinded envy itself. Yet peace had always slipped through my fingers like sand. And then came him, the man who had once fed me when I couldn't feed myself, not with food, but with humility. The man whose kindness had turned my arrogance into gratitude. And when I finally stood beside him again, I realized that what I had lost in wealth, I had found in grace. The next few days at the shelter blurred into a rhythm that felt both unfamiliar and comforting. I began volunteering quietly, arriving early, rolling up my sleeves, and losing myself in the ordinary sanctity of service. The smell of warm bread, the sound of laughter echoing against the cracked walls. It grounded me in ways my former life never could. And he was always there, moving with ease, speaking softly, smiling like a man who had made peace with everything he couldn't change. For 2 days, I said nothing to him. I watched instead, how he placed a steadying hand on an old man's shoulder, how he bowed slightly in greeting to every soul that entered, how he smiled not out of pity, but of understanding. There was something disarming about the way he gave. He didn't make charity look noble. He made it look necessary. On the 3rd day, fate cornered me into courage. The manager had paired us to serve together, side by side, one ladling, one handing plates. My fingers trembled when I realized he was close enough for me to feel the warmth of his arm. The air between us seemed heavier than it should have been. When I finally spoke, my voice was softer than I intended. "You once bought me dinner," I said, barely above a whisper. He paused, ladle midair, then slowly turned to look at me. His eyes, those eyes that had lived in my memory for years, searched my face, trying to place a ghost. Then recognition flickered. His lips curved into the faintest smile. "The diner," he said. "You left your wallet." I nodded, tears stinging the back of my eyes. "You paid without knowing who I was." He shrugged gently, his voice humble, unassuming. "You looked embarrassed. I couldn't let you walk out feeling small." That was all. No grand speech, no dramatic music. Just a simple truth spoken with the ease of a man who never expected repayment. But I couldn't stop staring at him, because in that moment, I realized that what he had given me that night wasn't charity. It was dignity. He remembered. After all these years, he remembered. We talked after the shift ended, sitting on the back steps behind the shelter as the sunset painted the city in gold and copper. I told him how life had unraveled after that night, how I had lost everything that money could buy, only to discover how little it was worth. He listened without judgment, just quiet understanding. He told me his story, too, how he had once worked as a construction supervisor until an accident took both his career and his savings. How he had rebuilt his life from nothing, piece by piece, learning to live with less but give more. His words weren't polished like my world had been, but they carried the kind of honesty that made you forget how to lie to yourself. We began working together every day after that. We fell into a rhythm that didn't need defining. He'd fix the broken stove, I'd repair torn uniforms, he'd hum old hymns while cleaning, and I'd join in off-key just to make him laugh. We didn't speak about love. It wasn't that kind of story yet. It was about rediscovering what it meant to feel human again. One afternoon, as we were closing up, I told him something I'd never said aloud. "I was rich once," I said. "I thought money meant power, but you gave me something I never had." He smiled, drying his hands on a rag. "And what's that?" "Peace," I whispered. He looked at me then, not the way men look when they want something, but the way souls recognize each other when they've both walked through fire. "Peace isn't bought," he said softly. "It's earned, by letting go." For the first time in years, I laughed without effort. A real laugh, the kind that shakes loose everything heavy in your chest. I had spent a lifetime searching for validation in boardrooms, contracts, and applause. But sitting there beside him, with the scent of bread and rain and kindness lingering in the air, I felt complete. We began talking every day after the shift ended. Sometimes about nothing, sometimes about everything. He'd tell me about the people he met, the small victories no one else noticed. I'd tell him about my past, my regrets, my fears. He never pitied me. He simply listened, as though hearing me was enough to make the world right again. And in those days, something wordless grew between us. Not romance, not yet, but something gentler. The kind of connection that doesn't need a label, because it already feels like home. I didn't realize how much I'd begun to depend on his presence until the day he wasn't there. The morning began like every other. Gray skies, a line of people outside the shelter, the smell of coffee and hope. But his apron hung untouched on its hook. His laughter wasn't echoing down the hall. I asked around, but no one had seen him. His name wasn't on the volunteer list that day. I waited through lunch, then through dinner, and when the shelter finally closed and I walked out into the dark, my chest felt heavier than it had in years. Because deep down, I knew this silence wasn't ordinary. Something had changed. Something had gone missing. And once again, the man who taught me peace had vanished into thin air. There are disappearances you expect, and then there are the ones that tear through your life like déjà vu. When he vanished the second time, it wasn't the kind of loss that leaves you angry. It was the kind that leaves you terrified. I had lived this pain before, watching him walk away into a silence I couldn't chase. But now, the woman who once watched her world collapse in a white wedding gown wasn't the same. I had lost too much to let fate repeat itself. Not this time. Not with him. The next morning felt hollow without his presence. The shelter buzzed with its usual chaos, the clatter of pots, the hum of conversation. But for me, it was all just background noise. His absence had weight. The air felt thinner, colder. Every corner I turned, I half expected to hear his laughter, that warm, grounding sound that made even the hardest days bearable. But his apron still hung untouched on the hook, the name tag swinging slightly, as though the air itself missed him. Days passed, each one slower than the last. No calls, no messages, nothing but silence filling the spaces he once occupied. I asked around quietly, trying to mask the urgency in my voice, until one of the volunteers, a soft-spoken woman who worked nights, finally told me she had seen him at a clinic on the east side of town. Her words cut through me like a blade wrapped in sorrow. A clinic. That evening, I went there. The waiting room smelled of disinfectant and despair, the kind of place where hope sat small and tired in the corners. I asked for him, but the nurse hesitated, glancing at the files before nodding slowly. "He comes. Here often," she said. "But he missed his last 2 appointments. He's been pushing himself too hard. He doesn't have anyone to make him stop." Something in my chest twisted. I learned he had been diagnosed months ago. Something chronic, manageable if treated, deadly if ignored. But he had chosen to keep working double shifts, refusing charity, living as though every act of rest was indulgence he couldn't afford. That night, I couldn't sleep. The city outside my window was loud, but all I could hear was the sound of him giving away food to strangers when he barely had enough for himself. The thought was unbearable. So I made a decision, quietly, secretly. I called the clinic the next morning and arranged for his bills to be paid, anonymously. No questions asked, no names given, just a promise that he would get the care he needed. For a week I felt lighter knowing he was receiving treatment, that maybe fate had finally allowed me to return the kindness he once gave me. I didn't need him to know. It wasn't about gratitude. It was about love that didn't demand to be seen. But love rarely stays hidden. He found out. I'll never forget that day. He walked into the shelter late, the sky outside bruised with storm clouds, and his expression was darker than I'd ever seen. His eyes, usually calm and patient, burned with quiet fury. He didn't say a word at first. He just stood there, arms crossed, looking at me like a man who had been betrayed. Then, softly but sharply, he said, "You paid for my treatment." I tried to explain, but he cut me off, his voice trembling between anger and pride. "Why would you do that? Do you think I can't take care of myself? I've lived like this for years. I don't need your pity." The word pity stung more than he knew. I took a step closer, searching his face for the man who once gave me everything without expecting anything in return. "This isn't pity," I said quietly, my voice breaking against the weight of what I felt. "It's what love does." The word hung between us, sharp and trembling. Love. He froze. The storm outside cracked with thunder, a low rumble echoing through the walls as if the universe itself had stopped to listen. I didn't take it back. I couldn't, because it was true. Every act, every breath, every sleepless night since I saw him again had been guided by a love I didn't plan for, but couldn't unfeel. He turned away, rubbing his hands together like he was trying to erase something invisible. "You shouldn't have done that," he whispered. "I don't know how to accept things I didn't earn." I stepped closer. "Then don't accept it as charity," I said. "Accept it as balance. You once gave me something money could never buy. Let me return it. Just this once." He didn't respond. The silence between us felt alive, painful, tender, sacred. And then, slowly, he looked up at me, eyes heavy with 1,000 unspoken things. "You shouldn't love me," he said. "I'm not the man you think I am." I smiled through the tears I didn't bother to hide. Neither am I the woman I used to be. We stood like that for what felt like forever. Two broken people realizing that love doesn't need perfect timing, just brave hearts. The air shifted between us. For the first time, I wasn't afraid of what I felt. I reached into my bag, the one thing I had carried with me since the day my life fell apart. A small velvet box that had gathered dust over the years, a symbol of everything that once meant love to me. But now, it was something else, entirely. I opened the box, revealing the ring I had kept hidden for years, the same one I never got to wear, the same one that once promised forever, but only delivered endings. I placed it gently in his hands and said, "Maybe it was never meant for the life I had before. Maybe it was meant for the one I found with you." He looked at it, silent, the storm still raging outside, and I saw his fingers tremble as though holding it might shatter everything he thought he knew about us. At that moment, I didn't know if he would keep it or walk away again. But for the first time, I was ready for either. I had been proposed to before, with chandeliers blazing above me, violins echoing from marble halls, and diamonds heavy enough to bruise my fingers. But none of it ever felt real. The men who knelt before me had offered comfort, luxury, security, but never peace. And that night, standing before the man who had once bought me dinner with his last coins, I finally understood what I had been searching for all along. Not a promise written in gold, but a truth spoken without pride. The storm outside had quieted into drizzle, the kind that makes the world smell clean again after chaos. He still stood there, holding the ring I had placed in his hands, as if afraid that closing his fingers around it would make it disappear. His eyes flickered between disbelief and confusion, the weight of my gesture pressing down heavier than either of us expected. He looked up slowly, his voice barely steady. "You can't mean this," he said, half whisper, half pleading. "This ring, it was meant for you." "I know," I replied softly, stepping closer. "But maybe it was never meant for the life I was living. Maybe it was always waiting for this moment. For us." He shook his head, laughing under his breath, though there was no joy in it. "I'm not that man, you know. I can't give you the world. I can't even promise tomorrow will be easy." I smiled sadly, tears threatening but refusing to fall. "You gave me more than the world ever did. You gave me back." He looked away, jaw tight, his pride and pain waging a quiet war inside him. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the disbelief that someone like me could choose someone like him, not out of charity, not out of pity, but out of love that had been born from ruin and rebuilt through kindness. "I'm not worthy of this," he said, his voice breaking. "You don't understand what I've done, what I've been through." I took another step closer, closing the space between us until I could feel his breath trembling in the air. "I don't need to understand it," I said softly. "I've made my own mistakes. I know what it means to be lost. I know what it means to be broken. You didn't just find me when I was lost. You reminded me what it means to see goodness again, to feel alive again. You saved me when I didn't even know I needed saving." He closed his eyes as if my words were too heavy to hold. "You're talking about one meal," he murmured. "No, I said, shaking my head gently. I'm talking about the moment you looked at me and didn't see a rich woman, or a failure, or a headline. You just saw someone who needed help, and you gave it without asking who she was. You think that was small, but it changed everything. You gave me something money never could. Peace. That's why this ring doesn't belong to me anymore. It belongs to the man who taught me what love is without saying the word. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The shelter around us was quiet now, the world outside soft and still. He looked down at the ring again, the diamond glinting faintly under the flickering ceiling light. I could see the reflection of both of us in its surface, two people shaped by different losses, now standing in the same redemption. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. You're serious. I've never been more, I whispered. He laughed softly, shaking his head, a tear finally escaping down his cheek. You're impossible, he said, and everything I never thought I'd deserve. He slid the ring into his palm, staring at it as though it were a living thing. Then, slowly, he looked up at me again, eyes shimmering with something between gratitude and disbelief. I have nothing to give you back, he said. No mansion, no title, no riches. Just this life, this small, quiet life. I stepped forward, reaching for his hand, and pressed it against my heart. Then that's what I want. A small, quiet life, one built from kindness instead of pride. One built with you. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he pulled me close, hesitant at first, like a man afraid the world might snatch away what it had finally allowed him to touch. His arms were warm, steady, and trembling all at once. I could feel his heartbeat through his chest, uneven, alive, terrified. You can't know what this means, he whispered against my hair. I don't need to, I said softly. I just know it feels right. He finally stepped back, holding the ring between us, his hands shaking. Then, with tears glistening in his lashes, he slipped it onto my finger, not as a promise of possession, but of partnership. You're wrong, he said quietly. I didn't save you. You saved me. In that instant, everything around us seemed to fade. The hum of the lights, the chill in the air, the noise of the city outside. There was just this moment. Two people standing in the wreckage of their pasts, building something neither of them believed they deserved, but somehow had been given anyway. I laughed through my tears, pressing my forehead against his. Then maybe, I whispered, we saved each other. He smiled, that same smile that had haunted and healed me all at once, the smile that started it all. And then, for the first time, he kissed me, not like a man claiming love, but like one thanking fate. We stayed there for a long time, two hearts beating against the silence, the ring glinting between us like a quiet vow. It should have been the end, the moment where stories fade into peace. But life rarely ends with love. It only deepens its tests. Because just as I began to believe that the world had finally given me back everything it took, fate whispered again, soft but cruel. Love was never the end of your story. It was only the beginning. Some places hold memories, others hold beginnings. The diner where he once fed me when I had nothing but pride, left, became the heartbeat of everything we would build together. It was the same cracked floor, the same flickering sign, the same faint smell of coffee that never quite left the walls. But this time, we weren't there to eat. We were there to feed, to turn one act of kindness into thousands. It started quietly, like all good things do, not with money, but with meaning. After the proposal, after the quiet yes that rewrote both our lives, we spent weeks talking about what came next. We didn't want grand houses or luxury or headlines. We wanted purpose, something we could leave behind that wasn't made of gold, but of grace. And so, one afternoon, while driving through the city, we passed that diner. The same one where years ago I had sat humiliated, pretending I wasn't falling apart. and he had placed his last few coins on the counter for a stranger he'd never see again. The "For Sale" sign hung crooked on the window, dust gathering on the glass. He parked the car and looked at me, his smile small but knowing. "What if," he said softly, "we make it what it was always meant to be?" "What do you mean?" I asked, though I already felt my heart tightening. He turned toward the building, eyes distant, full of something I hadn't seen in a long time. Hope. A place where no one ever leaves hungry. Not for food, not for kindness. A pay-what-you-can cafe. No prices, no judgment. The idea hit me like a prayer whispered into existence. That diner, the place that broke my pride but built my compassion. It felt sacred somehow, like fate had been waiting for us to return, not as who we were, but as who we had become. Within a month, the papers were signed, the keys handed over. When we stepped inside for the first time as owners, the archive's silence felt almost holy. The tables were old, the walls chipped, but I could still see it, the ghost of that night when he had changed my life with one simple gesture. We painted it ourselves. He fixed the lights that buzzed too loudly. I chose colors that felt like warmth, terracotta and sunlight yellow. We kept the same counter, the same spot where he once stood, because that's where our story had begun. And slowly, that empty diner began to breathe again. We named it The Table, because that's what it had always been, a place where people could come as they were, and still belong. When we opened the doors, we didn't know what to expect. But the first day, people came, not because they were hungry for food, but because they were hungry for hope. Some paid, some couldn't. It didn't matter. Every plate we served was a quiet reminder that kindness is the only currency that never loses value. The first few weeks were hard. Supplies ran low. Some nights we worked until dawn. But every morning, we found a line waiting outside the door. Word had spread, not just about the cafe, but about the story behind it. The woman who had once been rich, and the man who had once been poor, now feeding the world together. It became something beautiful. People who couldn't afford a meal came back later with small gifts, flowers, notes, even help washing dishes. Some offered to volunteer. Others simply stayed to talk. The walls began to fill with photos, messages, stories of gratitude written in every language imaginable. One afternoon, as the cafe buzzed with laughter and chatter, a young man walked in wearing worn-out shoes and a nervous smile. He hesitated before ordering, and I recognized the look instantly, the same look I had once worn, shame dressed as pride. I handed him a plate, and before he could protest, I said softly, "You don't owe us anything." He looked at me, eyes wet, and whispered, "Then why are you doing this?" I smiled, glancing toward my husband, yes, husband now, who was handing out coffee across the room. Because someone once did it for me. The cafe grew faster than we imagined. Local newspapers picked up the story. Then television crews came, curious about the miracle diner. They called it the place where love fed the hungry. We didn't ask for fame, but it found us anyway. Soon people came from all over the city, some to eat, some to help, some just to feel part of something bigger. We hired staff who had once been homeless, trained them, gave them steady pay, and watched as their lives began to rebuild. One paycheck, one smile at a time. There were nights when we would sit by the counter long after closing, sipping lukewarm tea and just listening to the hum of the refrigerators, the distant sound of rain tapping on the glass. He'd always smile and say, "You see, we didn't just open a cafe. We reopened hearts." And he was right. We didn't just serve food. We served dignity. But with light, shadows always follow. The more attention the table received, the more people wanted to know who we were, how we met, how it started, what it meant. They wrote articles, filmed documentaries, even called us the couple who rebuilt hope. I thought the exposure might help us do better. But I had forgotten something vital. Fame doesn't just draw admiration. It draws ghosts. One afternoon, as I was wiping down the counter, I noticed him standing by the window, staring outside at a figure across the street. His shoulders stiffened. His expression shifted from calm to something I hadn't seen before. Unease. I followed his gaze. A woman stood there, watching us. Her coat was sleek, her posture straight, her eyes locked on him with a familiarity that sent a chill down my spine. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She just watched. He froze for a moment too long before looking away, pretending he hadn't noticed. But the color had drained from his face. "Do you know her?" I asked quietly. He hesitated, just long enough for me to feel the weight of what he wasn't saying. "It's complicated," he murmured finally. "Someone I thought I'd never see again." That night, after we closed, he was distant. His laughter didn't reach his eyes. He said he was tired, but I knew better. Something had resurfaced, something buried deep in his past. I didn't press him. Not yet. But as I turned off the lights and locked the door behind us, I couldn't shake the feeling that the peace we had built inside those walls was about to be tested. Because sometimes, when you build a light bright enough to be seen by the world, it also illuminates the shadows you tried hardest to forget. And this shadow, I could tell, wasn't going to fade quietly. Some ghosts don't come back to haunt you. They come back to beg. I never imagined the woman who once shattered his heart, who walked away when he had nothing, would one day stand outside our door, her face pale beneath the streetlight, her eyes carrying the weight of every choice that had ruined them both. You never expect the person who destroyed the man you love to return asking for forgiveness, not with tears, but with desperation. The knock came just after sunset. I was closing up the cafe for the night, the scent of coffee still warm in the air when I saw her through the glass. A silhouette I didn't recognize, standing perfectly still, like she had been rehearsing the moment for hours. He was wiping down tables beside me, humming quietly, when he looked up and froze. I felt his body go still before I even turned. His eyes locked on the figure outside. "Mara," he whispered, the name falling from his lips like something half forbidden, half forgotten. I turned toward him, confusion giving way to realization. "You know her." He swallowed hard, the cloth slipping from his hand. "I did," he said softly. "A long time ago." When he opened the door, the air shifted. She stepped in slowly, her heels silent on the old floorboards, her eyes darting around the cafe, the walls painted with hope, the tables filled with warmth she didn't recognize. For a moment, it felt like two worlds colliding, the life he had built, and the one that had once broken him. "Hello, Michael," she said finally, her voice trembling just enough to sound human. He didn't move. "You shouldn't be here." Her eyes glistened. I didn't know where else to go. I stayed quiet, watching her from behind the counter. She looked nothing like the image I had built in my head, the rich, untouchable woman who had abandoned him when his world fell apart. This woman was smaller somehow. Her clothes were expensive but tired, her perfume faded, her eyes rimmed with sleeplessness. "I heard about the cafe," she said softly. "About what you two are doing. I just wanted to see it for myself." He folded his arms, his voice calm but cold. "You've seen it. Now you can leave." She flinched, then looked at me for the first time. There was something unreadable in her gaze. Not jealousy exactly, but recognition. The kind of look people wear when they realize the world kept moving without them. "I didn't come to cause trouble," she said, her tone breaking. "I came because I don't have anyone left. My business collapsed. The man I trusted took everything. I thought, maybe you could help." The silence that followed felt like it could cut through bone. He turned away, hands on his head, breathing slow and uneven. I could see it, the memories flickering behind his eyes, the pain resurfacing like an old wound reopened. "You walked out when I was drowning," he said quietly. You left when I had nothing, and now you want help. Tears slid down her cheeks, but her voice didn't waver. I made mistakes, Michael. I believed the wrong people. I thought love was something you could trade for comfort. I was wrong. He laughed bitterly, shaking his head. You didn't just trade love for comfort. You sold your soul for it. I stepped forward then, gently placing a hand on his arm. Maybe she doesn't need punishment, I said quietly. Maybe she just needs mercy. He looked at me like I had said something impossible. You'd forgive her. I met his gaze steadily. Once, someone forgave me when I didn't deserve it. Maybe this is your turn. He stared at me for a long moment, the weight of my words sinking in, softening something hard inside him. Then he sighed, running a hand over his face. You always see the good in people, he murmured. I smiled faintly. You taught me how. We invited her to sit. She hesitated, then took the seat near the window, the same seat I realized, where I had sat all those years ago when he'd bought my meal. Time has a strange way of circling back on itself. We listened as she told her story, how greed had cost her everything, how she had believed in lies wrapped in silk, how she had thought walking away from him was power, only to discover it was poverty of the soul. Her voice cracked when she said, I didn't come here for money. I came here because this is the only place I've seen love that still looks real. For the first time, I saw his anger falter. He leaned back, staring at her with quiet disbelief. You hurt me, he said. You broke me. I know, she whispered, and I can never undo that. But I had to see what you became without me. And I see now. You became better. The words hung between them like smoke, painful but cleansing in their honesty. He looked at me, and then back at her, his eyes heavy with history. You taught me pain, he said slowly. Then turning toward me, he added, voice trembling, but she taught me love. For a moment, even she smiled through her tears. It wasn't the smile of a woman forgiven. It was the smile of someone who finally saw the truth of what she had lost. When she stood to leave, she reached into her bag and placed a small envelope on the counter. This isn't for me, she said softly. It's for you both, to help this place grow. Maybe that's how I make peace with the past. He didn't touch it. He just nodded once, and she walked out into the night, her figure fading into the glow of the streetlights. The silence that followed was thick and heavy. He stood there, staring at the envelope, the rain beginning to patter against the glass. What if she's telling the truth? I asked quietly. He sighed. Maybe she is, but truth doesn't erase damage. It just names it. I nodded, wrapping my arms around him from behind, feeling the tension in his shoulders slowly melt away. You don't owe her your pain, I whispered. You already turned it into something beautiful. He turned, his eyes softening. I think I needed her to come back, he admitted. Not for closure, for contrast, to see who I used to be and who I am now. We stood there like that, surrounded by the hum of the city and the scent of fresh coffee, both knowing that something had shifted. The past had walked through our door, asked for forgiveness, and left a piece of itself behind. But we didn't yet know what kind of piece it was. The next morning, as I unlocked the cafe, I found the envelope still lying on the counter where she had left it. For a moment, I thought about throwing it away, but something stopped me. I picked it up, tore it open, and froze. Inside wasn't money. It was a single folded document, with his name printed across the top in bold letters, followed by a word that made my stomach twist. Inheritance. My pulse quickened as I read the rest, and realized that what she had left behind wasn't forgiveness. It was a claim, one that would tie our names to hers forever. Some truths arrive quietly, wrapped not in pain, but in small hands and innocent eyes. I thought the past had given us closure when she left, but sometimes the past doesn't vanish. It circles back in a form you never imagined. And when she returned, She wasn't alone. She came holding the one thing we didn't know our hearts were missing: a child. It was a slow morning at the cafe when the door opened and silence followed. He looked up from behind the counter and froze. She was standing there again, the woman who had once broken him beyond repair, but this time she wasn't alone. A little girl stood beside her, clutching a worn-out stuffed rabbit, eyes wide and unguarded. Those eyes, they were his. He stepped forward, confusion spilling into disbelief. "Mara!" "What is this?" he whispered. She took a trembling breath. "Her name is Amira," she said softly. "She's 6. And she's yours." The words didn't echo. They sank. He stood still, staring at the child as if the world had stopped spinning. "No," he said finally, his voice cracking. "You would have told me." Tears welled in her eyes. "I should have. I was scared. You had nothing then, and I thought she deserved more than struggle. But she's asking questions now, and you deserve the truth." The little girl looked up at him curiously. "Do I know you?" He knelt slowly, his hands shaking. "Not yet," he whispered, "but I hope you will." For a moment, everything inside the cafe fell away. The past, the pain, the years between them. It all dissolved in that fragile space where a father met his daughter for the first time. Mara explained everything: how she had left while pregnant, how pride and fear had built a wall she could no longer carry. Her voice trembled with regret, but she didn't ask for forgiveness, only understanding. He agreed to a test. We didn't need it. One look at that child was proof enough. Still, when the results came, confirming what Love already knew, he sat in silence, the paper trembling in his hands. "I missed 6 years of her life," he said quietly. 6 years I can never get back." I placed my hand over his. "Then start now," I whispered. "You can't rewrite the beginning, but you can shape everything that comes after." And he did. He learned to braid her hair, to tell bedtime stories, to make pancakes shaped like hearts. Every laugh that escaped her lips seemed to heal something broken in him. She called him Daddy, without hesitation, as if she had been saving the word for him all along. At first I thought I would feel like an outsider, but love has a way of expanding without asking permission. Amira would run to me with her drawings, hug me before bed, whisper secrets in my ear. One evening, as I tucked her in, she held my face between her small hands and said, "You smell like home." It broke me, in the gentlest way. Even Mara began to soften. She visited sometimes, quieter, humbled, almost grateful that her mistake had somehow created something this beautiful. And though their past could never be erased, there was peace in knowing forgiveness had finally taken root. The 3 of us, no, the 4 of us, became something we hadn't planned for. A family made not by perfection, but by grace. He often said, "I thought life had taken too much from me. I didn't know it was only making room for more." And when he looked at me, then at Amira, I saw it too. Love that had grown through ruins and come out blooming. But peace is never the end of a story. It's the pause before the next truth arrives. That night, as I tucked Amira into bed, she looked at me sleepily and said, "Mommy too. Did you get Daddy's letter?" I froze. "What letter?" She smiled faintly. "Mommy said it's for you, from before I was born." And in that heartbeat, I knew. The past hadn't finished speaking yet. I had gained a husband and a daughter. But the letter waiting in silence might change everything we thought we knew about love. Not every fairy tale needs chandeliers or gold. Some need cracked walls, faded paint, and a past that still hums with memory. I once thought love was measured by luxury, but standing there, surrounded by people who had nothing yet gave everything, I learned that true love only asks for presence. And that day, in the very shelter where he had once slept in hunger, we promised each other forever. The day began with sunlight filtering through the windows of the old shelter, the one that had once been his refuge and had later become our miracle. It smelled of coffee, bread, and nostalgia. The same cracked walls that had once echoed his silence now held the sounds of laughter, music, and community. Every corner carried a story: his survival, our reunion, and the love that had risen from both. We had been offered grand venues, luxurious gardens, even magazine features, but he refused them all. "If we're going to build forever," he said, "let's build it where it all began, where Grace found me before you did." So we did. The shelter was transformed, not by decorators or planners, but by the hands of people who owed us nothing yet, showed up anyway. The cafe team brought flowers from their own homes. The women from the soup kitchen cooked for days, creating a feast that smelled like love made edible. The volunteers hung strings of lights they'd borrowed from neighbors, and in the center of it all stood an aisle made of mismatched chairs and hope. Our daughter, Amira, was the flower girl, her laughter floating through the air like a melody I never wanted to stop hearing. She wore a white ribbon in her curls and carried a basket too big for her tiny hands. Every time she turned to throw petals, she giggled so loudly that everyone laughed with her. He stood at the front of the room, wearing a second-hand suit that didn't fit perfectly, but somehow looked better than any designer could have tailored. His tie was slightly crooked, his shoes scuffed, but his eyes held everything. The man who had once stood in line here for food now stood ready to build a family from ashes. As I walked down that aisle, wearing a simple white dress borrowed from Amara's godmother, I didn't see poverty. I saw poetry. I saw the faces of people who had lived through storms, but still clapped as if joy were something they could never lose again. I saw him, my miracle, smiling through tears he didn't bother to hide. When I reached him, he took my hands gently and whispered, "Do you remember the first time we met?" I smiled. "You paid for my meal." He nodded, his thumb brushing the ring I had once given him. "And you paid for my life." The ceremony was short, but every word felt infinite. The vows weren't rehearsed. They were raw. He promised to never forget where we came from. I promised to never stop reminding him how far we'd come. Amara stood between us, holding both our hands, looking up like she knew she was part of something sacred. When the time came to exchange rings, he hesitated for a moment. "These aren't new," he said softly. "They were melted from the coins I saved after that night in the diner, the ones that bought your meal." Gasps rippled through the room. I covered my mouth, unable to stop the tears. Those same coins, the beginning of everything, had come full circle. We slipped the rings onto each other's fingers as the crowd erupted in applause. People cried, laughed, clapped, and for a few perfect seconds, the world felt healed. Then came the quiet moment before the final words. He leaned in close, his breath warm against my ear, his voice trembling with something I couldn't yet name. He whispered, "Before I say I do, there's something I have to tell you." I froze, the applause fading into silence. His eyes shimmered, not with joy, but with the kind of truth that carries weight. "What is it?" I asked softly. He swallowed hard. "It's about the letter Amira mentioned, the one written before she was born." The room blurred around me. The music, the laughter, the light, all faded until it was just his voice and my pounding heart. And in that fragile pause before forever, I realized some vows begin with love and end with revelation. All I did was pay for a stranger's meal, but he gave me a lifetime in return. Sometimes you don't realize a small act of kindness is the start of an entire legacy. I used to believe miracles were rare, fleeting flashes that touched only a few, but standing in the place where our story began, watching others find hope in the same way we once did, I knew the truth. We weren't the miracle. Kindness was. The letter he mentioned on our wedding day had been written years ago, long before fate had brought us together again. In it, He'd written words he was too afraid to say out loud. How the night he met me changed him. How my gratitude had given him strength when he had none left. You were my miracle, the letter said. And if life ever lets me, I'll spend the rest of it being someone else's. He had. Years passed, and our cafe became something far greater than we'd ever imagined. The table, once a humble diner reborn through hope, grew into a movement. What started as a single act of love turned into a chain of kindness across cities. Each new cafe opened in the same spirit. No prices, no pride, only compassion. People began to call it the Miracle Chain, though to us it was still just a table, where no one was ever turned away. Everywhere we went, people asked the same question: how did it begin? And every time, I told them the same story, about a girl who forgot her wallet and a man who had nothing, yet gave everything. About a meal that became a seed, a shelter that became a home, and a love that became a legacy. We spoke at schools, on radio shows, even in front of government officials who couldn't quite understand how a cafe could heal people more than policy ever did. He always ended our talks with the same words, soft but steady. Kindness doesn't need money. It needs courage. Amira grew up in those walls. The cafe became her playground, her classroom, her world. She would greet strangers like friends, serve soup to elders, and listen to their stories with a patience that reminded me of him. One day, when she was 10, she found the first newspaper clipping about our story, the photo of him and me, smiling behind the cafe counter. She ran to me, clutching it in her tiny hands. "Is this really you?" she asked. I smiled. It was, before we had all of this. She studied the photo for a long time, then looked up and said, "You both look happy, like you already knew everything was going to be okay." I didn't tell her we hadn't known, that we'd only kept walking forward, hand in hand, through storms we never saw coming, because maybe that's all faith really is, continuing even when you can't see the light yet. We started a foundation soon after, the Miracle Project, to help single parents, displaced families, and anyone trying to rebuild from nothing. The first one opened inside the shelter where we were married. It became a second home for those who needed more than food. They needed a beginning. Years blurred into soft seasons. Our hair turned silver, our laughter softer, our silences deeper. Yet every morning, he still made me coffee before the sun rose, and every night he still said the same words before turning off the lights. "Thank you for coming back to that diner." One afternoon, during an interview, the reporter asked him, "What do you think is your greatest accomplishment?" He smiled and took my hand. "That she believed in me long enough for me to believe in myself," he said. "And that our story didn't end. It multiplied." I looked around at the crowd, at the volunteers serving food, at Amira leading a cooking class for young mothers, at strangers hugging after sharing meals, and I realized how right he was. We hadn't just rebuilt our lives, we'd rewritten what love meant. It wasn't grand. It was steady. It was ordinary miracles, repeated over and over, until the world felt a little kinder. That evening, as the cafe closed and the last lights dimmed, Amira came up to me, her voice soft and certain. "Mom," she said, the first time she'd dropped the two from Mommy too. He was right. You were his miracle. Tears filled my eyes. I hugged her tightly, my heart too full to speak. "No," I whispered finally. "We were each other's. Now, whenever I see someone hungry, I don't just see a stranger. I see the girl I used to be, the one who thought she had everything but had never truly been fed. I see the man who gave his last coins without hesitation. And I see the miracle that began with a single act of grace and grew into a life that fed thousands, because kindness never ends. It only passes hands. And as long as one person reaches for another, our story never really ends." If this story touched your heart, don't just scroll away. Share it with someone who still believes in second chances. Subscribe for more stories that heal, inspire, and remind us what kindness can build. Tell me in the comments, have you ever met someone who changed your life without even knowing it?